The candle on Lord Cyprian Ashworth's reading desk had burned down to a miserable stub. Wax pooled across the brass holder and dripped onto a stack of shipping ledgers he had been reviewing since supper. The tall clock in the corner of his private library showed 20 minutes past midnight, and the whole of Ravenscroft Manor had gone silent hours ago. Cyprian rubbed his eyes and pushed back from the desk. At 41, he was lean and sharp-featured, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and a jaw that carried the stubborn look of a man who had managed an inherited estate since the age of 19. He wore a simple waistcoat over his shirt, his cravat loosened and hanging like a tired rope around his neck. Most of the county regarded him as reserved, difficult to read, and generous only in private. The kind of duke who paid a tenant's medical bills without ever mentioning it at dinner. He reached for the glass of port sitting untouched beside the ledgers. His fingers had barely closed around the stem when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the old house settling. A breath, a whimper, then another, longer, and unmistakably human. Someone was crying outside his library door. Cyprian set the glass down and listened. The crying came in short, choked bursts, the kind a person makes when they are trying desperately to stay quiet and failing. He crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled the heavy oak door open. Marin Birch nearly fell forward onto the carpet. She caught herself against the doorframe with one hand, stumbling back a step as the light from the library spilled across her face. She was 23, small and slight, with reddish-brown hair pinned loosely beneath a white cotton cap that had shifted sideways during what looked like a long spell of distress. Her grey parlour-maid's dress was wrinkled at the apron, and her eyes, pale green and usually calm, were swollen red from crying. In her left hand she held a small glass vial. The liquid inside caught the candlelight and gleamed a dull amber. Cyprian looked at the vial, then at Marin's face. She was trembling from head to toe. "Miss Birch," he said, keeping his voice low, "what is the meaning of this?" Marin opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like stones down a hillside. "I was supposed to put it in your tea, my lord." Cyprian went very still. His hand remained on the door. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A sudden, cold attention, the way a hunting dog freezes when it catches a scent. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Your evening tea." Marin's voice cracked. She held the vial out toward him as though it burned her skin. "This was meant to go into your cup tonight. I carried it in my apron pocket through the whole of supper service. I stood right there in the corridor when Mrs. Garland brought the tray to your study, and I was supposed to add 3 drops while nobody was looking." "And did you?" "No, my lord." The tears came again, fast and hard. "I could not. I tried to make myself do it, and I could not." Cyprian took the vial from her hand carefully, holding it between 2 fingers as though it were a dead insect. He uncorked it, brought it near his nose, and sniffed once. A sharp, herbal bitterness. He corked it again and stepped aside. "Come inside," he said. "Now, before someone hears you." Marin hesitated. Every servant in the manor knew that being found alone with the Duke at this hour, in his private rooms, would mean immediate dismissal and a ruined reputation. But the look on Cyprian's face made it clear that this was not a request. She stepped inside. Cyprian closed the door and locked it. He pointed to a wooden chair near the fireplace. Marin sat, pressing her hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. Cyprian remained standing, turning the vial slowly between his fingers. "Who sent you to do this?" he asked. Marin looked down at her lap. "Corvus Hallowell." The name landed in the room like a stone thrown into still water. Cyprian's jaw tightened. Every landowner in the southern counties knew the name Corvus Hallowell. He ran a network of smugglers, forgers, and hired criminals that stretched from the coastal towns all the way inland to the market villages. The local constables had tried to catch him twice and failed both times. He operated through middlemen, couriers, and threats. Always threats. "How long has Hallowell have his grip on you?" Cyprian asked. 3 months, my lord." Marin's voice was barely a whisper. "He came to my family's farm after the harvest failed. My father owed £14 to the grain merchant and another 9 to the farrier. Hallowell bought both debts and told my father he would seize the farm unless I did exactly as he instructed. He placed me in your household through a forged letter of reference." "You have been here since September," Cyprian said slowly. "That was 5 months." "Yes, my lord. For the first 2 months, he only wanted information. Which rooms you used, what time you retired, who visited, what correspondence arrived. I passed notes through a courier who met me at the back gate every Thursday evening." She swallowed hard. "Then, last week, a man I had never seen before came to the gate instead. He gave me the vial and told me Hallowell wanted it done within 7 days. Cyprian looked at her steadily. "And you are telling me this now because you grew a conscience?" Marin lifted her head. The tears were still wet on her cheeks, but something fierce flickered across her face, a stubborn pride that surprised him. "You paid off my family's debts, my lord. 2 months ago you reviewed the county tenant rolls and cleared every outstanding balance under £20. My father's name was on that list. Hallowell no longer holds our farm. He has nothing over me anymore." She paused and drew a shaky breath. "But he does not know that yet. And when he finds out I failed to poison you, he will come for me and my family all the same." Cyprian stood quietly for a long moment. The candle on his desk guttered and hissed, throwing unsteady shadows across the bookshelves that lined every wall. He studied Marin's face, the fear in it, the exhaustion, and beneath all of that, a desperate honesty that was difficult to fake. He set the vial down on his desk beside the cold cup of tea. "You should have been dismissed and handed to the constables the moment you walked through that door," he said. Marin flinched. "But if I do that," Cyprian continued, pulling a chair from the corner and sitting down across from her, "Hallowell will know his plan has been exposed. He will disappear into the countryside, and neither you nor I will ever be safe from him again." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When he spoke next, his voice was calm, measured, and carried the weight of a man who had already begun to think 3 moves ahead. "So instead, Miss Birch, you and I are going to let him believe he has won." Marin stared at him. The fireplace had gone cold hours ago, and the library held that particular chill that crept into old stone houses after midnight, settling into the bones of anyone foolish enough to still be awake. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and waited for Cyprian to explain what he meant. He picked up the vial again and held it against the last flicker of candlelight. The amber liquid shifted inside the glass, thick and slow like honey mixed with something sharper. "This is not arsenic," he said, more to himself than to her. "Arsenic would be colorless in water and would have no scent worth noting. This has a botanical quality to it. Valerian, perhaps, mixed with something stronger." He turned the vial upside down and watched the liquid crawl along the glass. 3 drops in a cup of tea would not end a man. It would make him drowsy within the hour, feverish by morning, and bedridden for several days. To a household physician, it would look like a sudden attack of the nerves or a digestive complaint. Marin nodded slowly. "Hallowell told me it would put you to sleep, my lord, that you would be too ill to manage your affairs for a week at the very least." "Which means he does not want me gone," Cyprian said. "He wants me out of the way. There is a difference, and it is an important one." He set the vial down and tapped his finger against the desk twice, a habit he had when the gears of his mind were turning fast. "A man who wants you gone sends a knife. A man who wants you asleep needs time to do something while your eyes are closed." "What would he need time for?" That is exactly what we are going to find out. Cyprian stood and crossed to the window. The grounds of Ravenscroft Manor stretched out in the darkness, manicured lawns giving way to gravel paths, low garden walls, and beyond them, the black line of oak trees that marked the perimeter of the estate. Somewhere past those trees, Hallowell's people were waiting for a signal that the job had been done. He turned back to Merrin. Here is what I need you to understand. If I call the constables now, they will arrest you for attempted poisoning. Your confession means nothing without evidence against Hallowell, and that man covers his tracks the way a fox covers its scent. You would hang, and he would walk free within a fortnight. Merrin's face went pale. She gripped the edges of her chair. I am not going to let that happen, Cyprian said firmly. You came to me when you could have run. That counts for something in my house. But I need you to trust me completely from this moment forward, and I need you to keep your nerve. Can you do that? She met his eyes. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the tall clock. Then she straightened her back and gave a single, steady nod. Good. Cyprian reached for a fresh candle from the drawer and lit it from the dying stub. The room brightened. He sat down again and spoke carefully, laying each detail out like a man arranging pieces on a chessboard. Tomorrow morning, I am going to fall ill, convincingly, publicly, and with enough fuss to carry the news through every corridor of this house before breakfast is cleared. You will go about your duties exactly as you have every other day. Say nothing unusual, do nothing unusual. Let the household fill in the story on its own. And Hallowell's courier? Merrin asked. He expects a signal from me. Every time I complete an instruction, I am to leave a folded handkerchief tied to the iron gate spike on the east wall. If he does not see it by tomorrow evening, he will know something has gone wrong. Then you will leave the signal, Cyprian said. Exactly as planned. As far as Hallowell is concerned, his poison worked and his maid has done her duty. We give him everything he expects to see. Merrin frowned. You want me to keep pretending I work for him. I want you to keep pretending long enough for him to show us what he is actually after. A man like Hallowell does not go through the trouble of planting a servant in a duke's household just to put him in bed with a headache. There is something in this house or connected to this house that he wants, and he will only reach for it when he believes I cannot stop him. The plan carried risk, and Merrin knew it. If Hallowell suspected the deception for even a moment, his response would be swift. But the alternative, running, hiding, spending every remaining day looking over her shoulder, was worse. What about Mr. Aldrich? She asked. Aldrich Penworth was the head butler of Ravenscroft Manor, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s who had served the Ashworth family since Cyprian's father was alive. Nothing happened in the household without passing through his hands first. Cyprian considered this. Aldrich was loyal to a fault and sharp enough to see through a poor lie. Trying to deceive him would only create problems. I will speak to Aldrich at first light, Cyprian said. He will be told enough to play his part, that I am feigning illness for a private matter of security, and that the rest of the staff must believe it entirely. He does not need to know about Hallowell or the vial. The fewer people who hold the full truth, the safer we all are. And the physician? If you are supposed to be gravely ill, someone will send for Dr. Hartwell. Cyprian allowed himself a thin smile. Dr. Hartwell is in Bristol visiting his brother and will not return until the end of the month. I made sure of that last week when I lent him the fare for the coach. In his absence, Aldrich will inform the household that I have refused to see the village apothecary and insisted on resting in my chambers. Stubbornness is well within my reputation, Miss Birch. Nobody will question it. Merrin almost smiled at that. Almost. Cyprian leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. You carried that vial in your pocket for an entire evening, standing 10 feet from my tea tray, and you chose to walk up to my door and hand it over instead. I have known men with titles and fortunes who would not have had the courage to do the same. Marin looked away. Courage had very little to do with it, my lord. I simply could not live with the other choice. That is what courage is, Miss Birch. Go and get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and you will need a steady hand for all of it. She rose, gave a small curtsy, and moved toward the door. Before she reached it, Cyprian spoke once more. One last thing. From this point on, every instruction Hallowell sends you, every word his people speak to you, every detail, no matter how small, you bring it directly to me. We are playing his game now, but by the end of it, he will be playing ours. Marin slipped out into the dark corridor and pulled the door shut behind her. Cyprian listened to her footsteps fade down the passage, then turned to the vial sitting on his desk. He picked it up, uncorked it, and poured the contents slowly into the cold fireplace ash. The liquid soaked into the gray powder and vanished without a trace. The first move had been made. Everything that followed depended on making Corvus Hallowell believe that his plan was working perfectly, right up to the moment it collapsed around him. Cyprian blew out the candle and sat alone in the dark, thinking. By mid-morning, the entire household believed that Lord Cyprian Ashworth was dying. Aldrich Penworth played his part with the grim efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years managing a duke's residence. He summoned the senior staff to the servants' hall before breakfast and delivered the news with a face carved from granite. The duke had collapsed in his chambers during the night. He was running a high fever, could not keep food down, and had refused all visitors, including the village apothecary. The household was to carry on with its duties in complete silence. No one was to approach the east wing. No one was to speak of the Duke's condition outside the walls of Ravenscroft Manor. Naturally, every single person in the house was speaking of nothing else within the hour. Mrs. Garland, the cook, told the scullery girl that she had noticed the Duke barely touched his supper the night before. The scullery girl told the laundry maid, who told the gardener's boy, who told the stable hand, who told the farrier's apprentice, who had come to reshoe one of the carriage horses. By noon, the rumor had reached the village of Alderfield, 2 miles down the road, where it grew legs of its own and started running. Marin watched all of this unfold from the edges, going about her duties with her head down and her mouth shut. She polished the silver in the dining room. She swept the front hall. She carried fresh linens to the guest chambers that nobody was using. Every task was performed with the same quiet steadiness she had shown since arriving at Ravenscroft 5 months earlier, and not a single person in the household thought to look at her twice. That was the idea. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the light began to change. The late autumn sun dropped behind the tree line to the west, and long shadows stretched across the grounds like dark fingers reaching for the house. Marin set down her dusting cloth in the upstairs parlor, told the housemaid she was going to fetch herbs from the kitchen garden for Mrs. Garland, and walked out through the servants' entrance at the back of the manor. The kitchen garden was a small walled plot behind the scullery, full of thyme and rosemary and winter cabbage. Marin passed through it without stopping, crossed the gravel yard where the coal was stored, and followed the narrow path that ran along the inside of the estate's perimeter wall. The wall itself was old, built from rough gray stone during the previous century, standing about 8 feet high and topped with iron railings that had gone orange with rust in places. The east gate was a narrow service entrance, used mainly by delivery carts and tradesmen. It had a heavy iron latch and a row of decorative spikes along the top bar, each one about the size of a man's thumb. Marin reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a plain white handkerchief. She had folded it twice into a neat square, exactly as Hallowell's courier had instructed her months ago. The signal was simple. A handkerchief on the 3rd spike from the left meant the task was done. The absence of a handkerchief meant wait. A handkerchief on the 1st spike meant danger, abort, do not make contact. She tied the cloth around the 3rd spike with steady fingers, tugging the knot tight so the evening wind would not carry it off. Then she stepped back and stood in the shadow of the wall, waiting. She did not have to wait long. Cyprian watched from the window of a disused storeroom on the second floor of the manor's east wing. From here, he could see the perimeter wall clearly, the gate, the path, and the open ground beyond the estate where the road curved through a stretch of elm trees before joining the main turnpike toward Oakhaven. He had positioned himself behind the curtain with a brass spyglass borrowed from the map room, keeping the lens angled so it would not catch the fading sunlight and give away his position. At 17 minutes before 5, a rider appeared on the road. The horse was a dark bay, fast and well kept, the kind of animal that cost more than a farm worker earned in 2 years. The rider wore a long coat with the collar turned up and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. A dark cloth covered his nose and mouth. He brought the horse to a trot as he neared the estate wall, slowing just enough to scan the gate without fully stopping. Cyprian adjusted the spyglass. He could see the rider's gloved hand reach out as the horse passed the gate. The fingers found the handkerchief, pulled it free from the spike in one clean motion, and tucked it inside the coat. The entire exchange took fewer than 3 seconds. The rider did not look toward the house. He did not signal to anyone else on the road. He simply kicked the horse forward and disappeared into the trees at a steady canter. Professional, quick, practiced. Cyprian lowered the spyglass and let out a slow breath. He had suspected that Hallowell's operation was well organized, but seeing it, confirmed, was something else entirely. This was not some desperate gang of poachers or dock thieves. Hallowell ran his network with the discipline of a military outfit. Couriers, signals, timed movements, layers of separation between himself and the people who carried out his orders. Which meant that whatever Hallowell wanted from this house, it was worth a great deal of money, influence, or both. Cyprian made a mental note of the rider's build, the horse's markings, and the direction of travel. Southeast toward Oakhaven. That was interesting. Oakhaven was a harbor town, busy with trade ships and commercial warehouses. Cyprian owned property there, several buildings near the docks that he leased to shipping merchants. He had not thought much about those holdings in recent months, but now a small itch began forming at the back of his mind. Something about those properties, something he was not yet seeing. He stepped away from the window and found Marin waiting for him in the corridor outside. "It is done," she said quietly. "He took the signal." "I saw." Cyprian folded the spyglass and slipped it into his coat pocket. "The courier will carry that handkerchief straight to Hallowell or to someone who reports to him directly. By tonight, Hallowell will believe that I am lying upstairs in a fever, helpless and unaware. He will feel safe, and safe men make their next move quickly." Marin folded her arms. "What do you think his next move will be?" "He will want confirmation. A rumor of illness is useful, but a man like Hallowell does not commit to a plan based on a piece of cloth tied to a fence. He will send someone to verify, either through you or through another channel we have not yet discovered." Cyprian paused, weighing his words. "Which means you need to be ready. When his people reach out again, and they will, you must give them exactly what they want to hear. Every detail must match. Every answer must be calm and confident." "I understand, my lord." "Do you?" Cyprian studied her face in the dim corridor light. "Because from this moment, you are not simply a maid pretending to follow orders. You are standing between a very dangerous man and whatever he intends to take from me. If your nerve breaks, even for a moment, he will see it." Marin held his gaze without flinching. "My nerve held last night when I had a vial of poison in my hand and your tea 10 steps away. It will hold now." Cyprian regarded her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Get back to your duties before someone notices you have been gone too long. And Miss Birch, keep your ears open tonight. If anyone in this household received a visitor, a letter, or even a strange look from a tradesman in the past week, I want to know about it." Marin turned and walked back toward the servants' staircase, her footsteps quick and quiet on the worn carpet. Cyprian remained in the corridor, one hand resting on the cold stone wall, watching the last light of the day fade through the tall window at the end of the passage. The trap was being laid, one careful piece at a time. Hallowell believed he was pulling the strings. He had no idea that the strings had already been cut and retied to different hands entirely. The following afternoon, Marin left Ravenscroft Manor through the front gate for the first time since the deception had begun. She wore her plain brown walking dress and a dark woolen cloak with the hood pulled forward against the October wind. Over her arm, she carried a wicker basket covered with a cloth, the kind any servant might carry when running errands for a country household. Inside the basket sat a jar of gooseberry preserves, a wrapped parcel of candle wax, and a sealed envelope addressed to the apothecary in Alderfield. All of it genuine, all of it carefully arranged by Cyprian that morning to give Marin a believable reason for being on the road. Aldrich had announced at breakfast that Miss Birch would be walking into the village to collect a tonic for the Duke's fever, since Dr. Hartwell was still away and the household needed something to ease the master's discomfort. The other servants barely looked up from their porridge. Half of them expected the Duke to be finished by the weekend, and the rest had already started whispering about which relative would inherit the estate. Marin followed the main road south for half a mile, then turned onto Old Mill Road, a narrow, unpaved track that wound through open farmland before crossing a stone bridge over a shallow creek. The mill it was named after had burned down 12 years ago and was never rebuilt. All that remained was a blackened foundation and a broken water wheel, half buried in mud. The crossroads sat just beyond the bridge, where Old Mill Road met a cart track that led east toward the coast. It was a quiet, empty stretch of countryside. The nearest farmhouse was over a quarter-mile away, hidden behind a low ridge. The hedgerows on either side of the road were thick and overgrown, blocking the view from every direction. Hallowell had chosen this spot well. Marin reached the crossroads at 20 minutes past 2 and set her basket on the stone wall beside the bridge. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, watching the cart track to the east. The wind pushed at her cloak and scattered dry leaves across the road. A crow sat on a fence post nearby, watching her with the dull interest that crows give to anything that might eventually produce food. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Marin kept her breathing steady and her face composed, though her pulse was knocking hard against her ribs. She had rehearsed this meeting with Cyprian twice that morning, sitting across from him in the library while he asked her every question he could think of that Hallowell's people might ask. He had pressed her on details, challenged her answers, even raised his voice once to test whether she would stumble under pressure. She had not stumbled. But Cyprian was a gentleman, playing the part of an interrogator. The man she was about to meet was the genuine article. The sound of hooves reached her before she saw the rider. A single horse, coming at a walk from the east. The animal appeared around a bend in the cart track, a grey mare with a clipped mane, ridden by a broad-shouldered man in a dark green riding coat and mud-spattered boots. He wore no hat, and his head was shaved close to the scalp, revealing a thick scar that ran from above his left ear down to the base of his jaw. His eyes were small and deeply set, and they fixed on Marin with the flat, measuring look of a man who was used to deciding very quickly whether someone was useful or disposable. This was Jonas Creve, Hallowell's chief lieutenant. Marin had met him once before, 3 months ago, when he had come to the back gate of the manor at midnight to deliver her first set of instructions. He had spoken to her for less than 2 minutes that night, and had made it clear that if she ever failed to follow an order, her father's farm would be ash by sunrise. Creve brought the mare to a stop a few yards from the bridge and dismounted without greeting her. He tied the reins to the fence post, displacing the crow, which flapped away with an irritated croak. Then he walked over to Marin, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Well," he said. One word, no warmth in it. "It worked," Marin said. She kept her voice flat, the way a person speaks when they are reporting facts rather than offering opinions. I put the drops in his evening tea 2 nights ago. He drank the full cup. By midnight he was sweating and could not stand. His butler found him on the floor of his bedchamber the next morning and has kept everyone away from his room since. Creve studied her face. Has a physician seen him? The household physician is away in Bristol. The butler wanted to send for the village apothecary, but the Duke refused. He believes it is a stomach ailment and insists on resting it off. He will not see anyone. Stubborn fool, Creve muttered. He reached into his coat and produced a thin black cigarette, striking a match against the stone wall and cupping his hands around the flame. The smoke curled upward and vanished in the wind. How long before he is back on his feet? I cannot say for certain. He was still in bed when I left this morning. The cook said he would not take broth or bread. The maids think it is something worse than a stomach complaint. Marin paused, then added carefully, The household is frightened, Mr. Creve. They are talking about sending word to his solicitor in London. Creve waved this off with a sharp flick of his cigarette hand. Let them send word to whoever they like. By the time a solicitor arrives from London, our business will be finished. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it between 2 fingers, but did not hand it over immediately. Mr. Hallowell is pleased with your work, he said, and the words carried the tone of a man who thought praise was a waste of breath. There is one more thing he needs from you, and then your service to him is complete. Marin felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression steady. What does he need? Creve unfolded the paper. On it was a rough sketch, a rectangular object with a rounded bow and a short shaft drawn in dark ink. A key. In the Duke's private study, there is a desk with a locked bottom drawer on the right side. Inside that drawer, you will find a sealed brass key, roughly 4 inches in length, with a double ward pattern on the bit. Mr. Hallowell needs that key delivered to him within 2 days. Marin looked at the sketch. What does the key open? Creve's expression did not change, but something cooled in his eyes. That is not a question you need to ask, Miss Birch. Find the key, bring it to the chapel ruins south of Oakhaven by Thursday evening. Mr. Hallowell will be there himself to collect it. He folded the paper and held it out to her. Marin took it and slipped it into the basket beneath the cloth. Thursday evening, Creve repeated. Do not be late, and do not think about disappearing. Mr. Hallowell has eyes in places you have not thought to look. He untied the mare, swung himself into the saddle, and rode back the way he had come, without another word. Marin stood at the crossroads and watched him go until the sound of hooves faded into the distance, and the gray horse was nothing more than a speck on the far curve of the cart track. She picked up the basket, smoothed the cloth over its contents, and walked back toward Ravenscroft Manor at an unhurried pace. Her face betrayed nothing. Inside, her mind was racing. Cyprian had been right. Hallowell wanted something specific from the estate, something that required the Duke to be unconscious and the household to be in disorder. A brass key from a locked desk drawer. Whatever that key opened, it was important enough for Hallowell to come out of hiding and collect it personally. Marin quickened her step as the rooftops of the manor appeared above the tree line. She needed to reach Cyprian before the afternoon light was gone. The game had just changed, and the clock was now ticking toward Thursday. Marin found Cyprian in the secret archive room. Most of Ravenscroft Manor's rooms were well known to the household staff. Every parlor, bedroom, and storage closet had been swept, polished, and maintained by generations of servants. But the archive room was different. It sat behind a false panel in the back wall of Cyprian's private study, accessible only through a narrow door disguised as a section of oak bookshelf. The door opened on a concealed brass hinge when a particular volume on the third shelf, a leather-bound copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, was tilted 45 degrees to the left. Cyprian had shown Marin the entrance that morning before she left for the crossroads, instructing her to come directly to him upon her return without speaking to anyone else first. When she pushed through the hidden door, she found him seated at a small writing table surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers, rolled maps, and leather folios tied with ribbon. A single oil lamp burned on the corner of the table, casting a warm circle of light that did not quite reach the stone walls. He looked up as she entered. "Close it behind you." Marin pushed the panel shut and heard it click into place. The sounds of the house, footsteps in the corridor, the distant clatter of the kitchen, vanished completely. The archive room was lined with stone on 3 sides and thick timber on the 4th, built decades ago by Cyprian's grandfather as a private repository for the family's most sensitive documents. Deeds, contracts, wills, shipping agreements, financial ledgers, anything too valuable or too dangerous to leave in an ordinary desk drawer ended up here. "Sit down," Cyprian said, pushing a wooden stool toward her with his foot. "Tell me everything, every word, every pause, every expression on his face." Marin sat and recounted the meeting at the crossroads from beginning to end. She described Creeve's appearance, his manner of speaking, the questions he had asked, and the order in which he asked them. She repeated her own answers as precisely as she could remember them. When she reached the part about the brass key, she took the folded sketch from her basket and laid it on the table in front of Cyprian. He picked it up and studied the drawing in silence. His thumb traced the outline of the key, the rectangular bow, the short shaft, the double ward pattern at the bit. After a long moment, he set the paper down and leaned back in his chair. "A double ward brass key, 4 inches, bottom right drawer of my study desk," he said quietly. He described it exactly. "You know which key he means?" "I do." Cyprian stood and crossed to a heavy iron strongbox that sat on the floor in the far corner of the archive room. He produced a ring of keys from his waistcoat pocket, selected a small flat one, and unlocked the strongbox. From inside, he lifted a brass key that matched the sketch precisely. Old, heavy, with a finely cut ward pattern that caught the lamplight. He held it up for Marin to see. "This key opens a private vault in the Oakhaven Commercial Banking House. I keep the key here in this room, though I also kept a second copy in my study desk as a convenience. The vault itself contains documents, property deeds, leasing contracts, letters of title." "For what property?" Cyprian set the key on the table and unrolled one of the maps that had been sitting beneath a stack of ledgers. It was a detailed survey of the Oakhaven harbor, drawn in fine ink and dated 1839. The coastline curved in a broad crescent, with the town clustered along the western shore and a series of long wooden docks extending out into the deeper water to the east. Each dock was numbered, and beside each number was a name, the registered owner. Cyprian's finger landed on docks 4, 5, 6, and 9. All 4 bore the same notation: Ashworth Estate, freehold title. "These 4 docks handle roughly a third of the commercial shipping traffic that passes through Oakhaven," Cyprian said. "Timber from the northern counties, wool from the Midlands, coal from Wales. It all comes through here before being loaded onto merchant vessels bound for the continent. The leasing fees alone bring in over £600 a year." Marin looked at the map. £600 was an enormous sum. Her father's entire farm, livestock included, was worth perhaps 90. "Hallowell wants the docks," she said. "He wants the deeds to the docks." Cyprian tapped the map with his knuckle. "If he holds the original title documents, he can forge a transfer of ownership. A convincing enough forgery, presented to a sympathetic solicitor, could tie the matter up in legal proceedings for years. In the meantime, Hallowell would control the docks, collect the leasing fees, and use the wharves to move whatever cargo he pleases without interference. Smuggled goods, untaxed imports, anything his network needs to ship in or out of the country." He rolled the map back up and tied it with a piece of cord. That is why he did not want me gone. A finished duke invites an immediate investigation. Every document in my estate would be reviewed, every asset accounted for, every irregularity examined under a magistrate's eye. Hallowell cannot afford that kind of scrutiny. He needs me alive, ill, and distracted long enough for him to walk into that vault, take the deeds, and disappear before anyone realizes what has happened. Marin absorbed this in silence. The scope of Hallowell's plan was larger than she had imagined. She had thought this was about intimidation, about a criminal flexing his power over a wealthy man for the satisfaction of it. Instead, it was a calculated theft designed to shift the commercial balance of an entire harbor town into the hands of a man who operated outside the law. "So, what do we do?" she asked. Cyprian sat back down and pulled the brass key toward him, turning it slowly on the tabletop. "Hallowell expects you to deliver this key by Thursday evening. If you fail to appear, he will know something is wrong. If you appear with the real key, he gains access to the vault and everything inside it. Then, we give him a key that does not work." Cyprian looked at her. A faint trace of approval crossed his face, the kind of expression a tutor might show when a student arrives at the correct answer ahead of schedule. "We give him a key that works once," Cyprian said. "There is a difference. A key that fails to open the lock tells Hallowell immediately that he has been deceived. He would vanish before we could lay a hand on him. But a key that opens the vault door and then breaks inside the inner lock, that puts him exactly where we want him, inside a sealed room with no way out." Marin frowned. "Can such a key be made?" "There is a blacksmith in Oakhaven named Thorn. He forged the original lock mechanism for the banking house vault 15 years ago, and he has done private work for my family since before I inherited the estate. If anyone can build a key designed to fail at the right moment, it is Thorn." Cyprian picked up the brass key and closed his fist around it. "Tomorrow morning, you and I ride to Oakhaven. We visit Thorn, we commission the duplicate, and we begin setting a trap that Corvus Hallowell will walk into with both eyes open and his hands full of stolen property." He paused and looked at Marin directly. "This is the part where it becomes dangerous, Miss Birch. Until now, you have been passing messages and tying handkerchiefs to fence posts. After Thursday, you will be standing face to face with Hallowell himself, handing him a key and looking him in the eye while you do it. If he suspects you for even a moment, there will be no second chance for either of us." Marin met his gaze across the small table in that hidden room, surrounded by the collected documents of a family that had held power and land for generations. She thought of her father's farm, of the debt that had nearly destroyed them, of the night she had stood outside this man's door with poison in her hand and made the only choice she could live with. "I will be ready," she said. Cyprian nodded once and turned back to the map of Oakhaven Harbor, already planning the next move. They left Ravenscroft Manor before dawn. Cyprian had arranged for 2 horses to be saddled and brought to the rear courtyard by the stable hand, a quiet young man named Pip, who asked no questions and expected no explanations. The cover story was simple. Aldrich informed the household that the Duke, despite his illness, had insisted on sending Miss Birch to collect a particular herbal remedy from a specialist in the coastal town, and that a hired escort would accompany her for safety on the road. No one in the household would see Cyprian leave. He departed through a service door on the north side of the manor, while the kitchen staff were occupied with the morning fires. Cyprian wore a plain brown riding coat, a flat cap, and a pair of scuffed leather boots that belonged to one of the groundskeepers. Without his tailored waistcoat and high collar, he looked like any middling farmer or merchant heading to town on business. Marin rode beside him in her usual grey dress beneath a heavy cloak, her wicker basket strapped to the back of her saddle. The road to Oakhaven ran southeast through rolling hills and patchwork farmland, following the course of a narrow river that widened as it approached the coast. The journey was roughly 9 miles, and at a steady pace they would arrive before the town was fully awake. October fog hung low over the fields, muffling the sound of the horses' hooves and reducing the hedgerows on either side to vague, dark shapes. They rode in silence for the first mile. Merrin kept her eyes on the road ahead, her hands steady on the reins. Cyprian watched the landscape with the alert, sweeping attention of a man who was conscious that Hallowell's people could be anywhere. "Have you been to Oakhaven before?" he asked as they crossed a stone bridge over the river. "Once, my lord. My mother took me when I was 9 years old. There was a market day, and she wanted to buy cloth for a Sunday dress." Merrin paused. "I remember the ships in the harbour. I had never seen anything so large." "The harbour is bigger now. 3 new docks were built in the last decade, and the merchant traffic has doubled since the railway reached the inland towns." Cyprian adjusted his cap against the wind. "Oakhaven is becoming one of the most valuable ports on the southern coast, which is precisely why a man like Hallowell has his eye on it." They reached the outskirts of Oakhaven just after 7 o'clock. The town sat in the curve of a broad natural bay, its buildings climbing the hillside in uneven rows of brick and timber. The harbour stretched along the waterfront, a forest of masts and rigging, with cargo ships moored alongside fishing boats and coastal traders. Even at this early hour, dock workers were hauling crates and rolling barrels along the stone quays, and the sharp smell of salt, tar, and smoked fish filled the air. Cyprian led them away from the harbour and up a steep, cobbled lane that wound through the older part of town. The buildings here were lower and narrower, with workshops and trade premises squeezed between boarding houses and public houses that had not yet opened their doors. At the top of the lane, set back from the street behind a low stone wall, stood a forge. The sign above the door read, "E. Thorne & Son, Ironwork, Locks, and Fine Metalcraft." The chimney was already breathing smoke into the grey morning sky, and the rhythmic ring of a hammer on an anvil echoed from inside. Cyprian dismounted and tied his horse to the post outside. Merrin did the same. He paused at the door, glanced up and down the lane to make certain they had not been followed, and then pushed it open. The forge was a single large room, low-ceilinged and warm as a bread oven. The far wall was dominated by a brick hearth where a coal fire burned white at its center, fed by a leather bellows that hung from an iron frame. Tools lined every surface: tongs, files, punches, molds, chisels, and an assortment of hammers ranging from delicate instruments no bigger than a spoon to heavy-headed sledges that could flatten a horseshoe in a single blow. The air tasted of iron and ash. Edmund Thorne stood at the anvil with his back to the door. He was a compact, powerfully built man in his middle 50s, with thick forearms and hands that were permanently stained gray from decades of metalwork. His leather apron hung to his knees, scorched and pitted with burn marks. When he turned at the sound of the door, his face, broad, weathered, deeply lined around the eyes, registered surprise for a brief moment before settling into careful recognition. "Lord Ashworth," he said, setting down his hammer. His eyes moved to Merrin, then back to Cyprian. "I was told you were ill." "You were told correctly," Cyprian said, pulling the door shut behind them. "As far as the rest of the world is concerned, I am lying in bed at Ravenscroft Manor with a fever that may carry me off by the weekend. I would appreciate it if you did nothing to contradict that story, Mr. Thorne." Thorne wiped his hands on a rag and tossed it over his shoulder. He had known Cyprian since the Duke was a young man, and he had done enough private work for the Ashworth family to understand that some commissions came with questions that were better left unasked. "What do you need?" Thorne said simply. Cyprian reached into his coat and produced the brass key. He laid it on the anvil between them. Thorne picked it up, turned it over in his thick fingers, and examined the ward pattern with the practiced eye of a man who could read a key the way a scholar reads a book. "Double ward, brass alloy, hand cut," Thorne murmured. "I made this lock. Oakhaven Banking House, the private vault on the lower level." "That is correct. I need you to make an exact duplicate of this key in iron. Same dimensions, same profile, same weight in the hand. A person holding both keys side by side should not be able to tell the difference without looking very closely. Thorn raised an eyebrow. You want a copy of your own key? I want a copy that will fail. Cyprian leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms. The duplicate needs to open the outer vault door without any trouble. The wards must match perfectly for that first lock. But when the key is turned in the inner mechanism, the chest lock inside the vault, I need the shaft to snap cleanly at the collar. One turn, and the key breaks off inside the lock. Thorn set the key down and scratched the side of his jaw with one blackened thumbnail. That is delicate work. If I make the shaft too weak, it will snap in the outer door and the whole thing fails early. Too strong, and it will survive the inner lock and work as a proper key. The breaking point has to be exact. Can you do it? Thorn looked mildly offended by the question. I built the lock, Lord Ashworth. I know every pin, every spring, and every tolerance inside that mechanism. I can score the shaft at the precise point where the torque of the inner lock will exceed the strength of the metal. One full turn, clean snap, broken bit lodged in the cylinder. The lock will jam permanently. Nobody opens that chest or that vault door again without a locksmith and 3 hours of work. How long do you need? Give me the day. Iron takes longer to finish than brass, and I will need to match the color with a patina wash so it does not look freshly forged. Come back before sundown, and it will be ready. Cyprian nodded and placed 3 gold sovereigns on the anvil beside the key. Thorn glanced at the coins. It was 3 times his usual rate for a job of this size, and swept them into his apron pocket without comment. One more thing, Cyprian said as he turned toward the door. If anyone comes asking about this work, anyone at all, this meeting did not happen and you have never seen this key. Thorn picked up his hammer and turned back to the anvil. What key? He said, and the ringing of metal on metal filled the forge once more. Cyprian and Marin stepped out into the cobbled lane. The fog was lifting, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds over the harbor. They had a full day to wait before the duplicate would be ready, and Cyprian intended to spend it wisely. We have another stop to make before we collect the key this evening, he said as they untied the horses. There is a man in this town I need to speak with, quietly and without leaving a trail. Marin mounted her horse and looked down at him. Who? The magistrate, Cyprian said. It is time to start closing the doors that Hallowell does not yet know exist. Thursday evening arrived, with a cold wind blowing in from the sea. Marin stood at the edge of the Ravenscroft estate grounds, watching the last trace of daylight sink behind the hills to the west. The duplicate key sat in the pocket of her cloak, wrapped in a square of cloth to keep it from clinking against the small coins she carried for appearances. She had held the key in her hand 3 times that afternoon, testing its weight, memorizing the feel of it against her palm. It was heavier than she expected. Thorn had done remarkable work matching the dimensions, but iron carried more weight than brass, and if Hallowell knew keys the way a locksmith did, he might notice the difference. Cyprian had considered this. Before she left, he had rubbed the surface of the duplicate with a thin layer of beeswax mixed with brass filings, giving it a faint golden sheen that would pass a casual inspection in poor light. The ruined chapel where Hallowell had arranged the meeting would be dim at best. No gas lamps, no candles, only whatever moonlight found its way through the broken roof. It would have to be enough. She had asked Cyprian that morning whether he would be nearby during the meeting. His answer had been direct and honest. I cannot be anywhere near that chapel, he had said, standing in the archive room with his hands clasped behind his back. Hallowell has survived this long because he is careful. He will have men watching the roads, the fields, and every approach within a quarter mile of that ruin. If he sees a second figure, or even suspects that you did not come alone, he will abandon the meeting, and we will lose him entirely. So I go alone, Marin had said. You go alone. You hand him the key. You answer his questions calmly and briefly, and then you leave. Do not linger. Do not volunteer information he has not asked for. The more you say, the more chances he has to catch you in something that does not add up. Marin had nodded and said nothing further. There was no point in discussing the fear. It was there, sitting in her chest like a stone, and it would remain there until the meeting was over. Talking about it would not make it lighter. She took a horse from the stable, her own errand horse, the dappled mare she had used for the trip to the crossroads, and rode south along the coastal road toward Oakhaven. The chapel ruins sat on a low hill roughly a mile north of the town, overlooking a stretch of rocky shoreline where the waves broke against black stones and sent spray into the wind. The building had once served a small fishing community that had long since moved closer to the harbor. All that remained were 4 stone walls, half a roof, and a courtyard choked with ivy and fallen masonry. Marin arrived at 7:15. She tied the mare to a twisted oak tree at the base of the hill and climbed the footpath on foot, her boots slipping on loose gravel in the fading light. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the smell of seaweed and the distant sound of waves. The courtyard of the chapel was enclosed on 3 sides by crumbling walls. The 4th side opened onto the hillside, giving a clear view of the road below and the dark line of the sea beyond. A stone archway that had once held a wooden door framed the entrance, its top cracked and leaning at a dangerous angle. Hallowell was already there. He stood in the center of the courtyard with his back to the far wall, a tall figure in a long black coat with a high collar turned up against the wind. He was older than Marin had expected, perhaps 50, with gray hair cropped short and a narrow face dominated by sharp cheekbones and a long, straight nose. His eyes were pale, almost colorless in the dim light, and they settled on Marin the moment she stepped through the archway with an attention that felt physical, like a hand pressing against her chest. 2 men stood behind him, positioned on either side of the far wall. One was Creve, the lieutenant she had met at the crossroads. The other was a younger man she did not recognize, lean and watchful, with his arms folded across his chest. Neither of them spoke. Hallowell studied Marin for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin, measured expression that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Birch," he said. His voice was low and surprisingly refined, carrying the clipped vowels of a man who had either been educated well or had taught himself to sound as though he had. "You have been very useful." "I did what you asked, Mr. Hallowell." "So I am told." He took a step forward. "And how is the Duke? Still suffering in his bedchamber?" "He is worse than before. His butler has written to a physician in London, but no reply has come. The household expects the worst." Hallowell tilted his head, examining her face the way a jeweler examines a stone for cracks. "You seem remarkably composed for a girl whose employer is dying." Marin kept her expression flat. "He is my employer, Mr. Hallowell. He is not my father." Something flickered behind Hallowell's pale eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or a grudging respect for the coldness of the answer. He extended his hand, palm upward. "The key." Marin reached into her cloak and produced the cloth-wrapped duplicate. She placed it in Hallowell's hand without hesitation. He unwrapped it slowly, turning the key over between his long fingers. He held it up to catch the faint moonlight that filtered through the broken roof, examining the ward pattern, running his thumb along the shaft, testing the weight. Marin's heartbeat climbed. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, keeping her hands still at her sides. Hallowell looked at the key for what felt like an entire minute. Then he closed his fist around it and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "In the bottom right drawer of his study desk, exactly where your man described. The drawer was locked, but the Duke keeps a ring of small keys in the top drawer, which was open. I waited until the butler was occupied with the evening meal and let myself into the study." "Was anyone in the corridor?" "The footman passed at 7:30, but he does not check the study door. He walks straight through to the front hall and back. Hallowell glanced at Creve, who gave a slight nod. These details matched whatever intelligence they had already gathered about the household routines. "And you were not seen," Hallowell said. It was a statement, not a question. "I was not seen." Hallowell reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Merrin, who caught it with both hands. It was heavy, coins by the feel of it. £15, Hallowell said, "for your trouble. Consider your debt to me settled, Miss Birch. You have done well, and I have no further use for you. Go back to your kitchen floors and your dusting cloths, and forget that you ever heard my name." Merrin tucked the pouch into her basket and gave a small, careful nod. She did not thank him. Thanking a man like Hallowell would have rung false, and false notes were dangerous. She turned and walked back through the archway, forcing herself to maintain a steady, unhurried pace down the hillside path. Behind her, she could hear Hallowell speaking quietly to Creve, though the wind carried the words away before she could make them out. She reached the mare, untied the reins, and mounted with hands that were trembling so badly she had to grip the pommel to steady herself. The leather pouch sat in her basket like a piece of evidence, which, she realized, it was. Hallowell had just paid her for stealing from a duke. If this ever went before a magistrate, that money would speak louder than any testimony. She turned the horse north and rode back toward Ravenscroft Manor at a brisk trot, keeping to the main road where other travelers might still be moving. The key was in Hallowell's pocket. The trap was set. Whatever happened next was in Cyprian's hands. The wind pushed at her back all the way home, as though the sea itself was urging her to move faster. Cyprian had not slept. He had spent the night in the archive room, sitting at the writing table with the original brass key in front of him and a detailed architectural plan of the Oakhaven commercial banking house spread open beneath the lamp. The plan was old, drawn up 20 years earlier when the building was constructed, but he had confirmed with the bank custodian during his visit 2 days ago that no significant alterations had been made to the lower levels since then. The walls were the same, the doors were the same, and most importantly, the vault was the same. When Merrin returned from the chapel meeting shortly before 9 o'clock that evening, she had come straight to the archive room and told him everything. Hallowell had taken the key. He had believed her story. He had paid her and dismissed her from his service. The exchange had gone exactly as planned. Cyprian had listened carefully, asked 3 follow-up questions about the men who had been present, and then told her to eat something and rest. There was nothing more for Merrin to do. The next stage of the plan belonged entirely to him. At first light on Friday morning, he dressed again in the borrowed riding coat and flat cap, slipped out through the north service door, and rode for Oakhaven alone. The fog had returned overnight, thicker than before, turning the road into a grey corridor walled by hedgerows he could barely see. He pushed the horse hard, reaching the outskirts of town before the church bell struck 7. The magistrate's house stood on a quiet residential street behind the town hall, a tall, narrow brick building with green shutters and a polished brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Cyprian tied his horse around the corner, out of sight from the main road, and knocked 3 times. The door was opened by a housemaid who looked startled to find a visitor at this hour. Before she could speak, a voice from the hallway behind her called out, "Let him in, Agnes. I have been expecting him." Magistrate Horace Pemberton appeared in the doorway of his study, a stout, white-haired man of 62 with round spectacles perched on a broad nose and the permanently weary expression of someone who had spent 3 decades enforcing the law in a harbor town. He wore a dark blue morning coat over a cream waistcoat, and he held a cup of tea in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. Cyprian stepped inside, and the housemaid closed the door behind him. "You look like a sheep farmer," Pemberton said, eyeing Cyprian's disguise over the rim of his spectacles. "That is the general idea." "Sit down. Tea?" "No time." Cyprian followed Pemberton into the study and closed the door. The room was small and cluttered. law books stacked on every surface, papers pinned to a board on the wall, a map of the Oakhaven Harbor District marked with colored pins that tracked ongoing investigations. Cyprian had visited this room 2 days earlier, during his trip with Marin to the blacksmith, and had given Pemberton the broad outline of the situation. Now it was time to fill in the details. "Hallowell has the key," Cyprian said, taking a seat across from the magistrate's desk. "He collected it from my agent last night at the ruined chapel south of town. He believes I am bedridden at Ravenscroft, and that the key is genuine." Pemberton set his tea down and lowered himself into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose knees had seen better years. "And the duplicate? It will function as described?" "Thorne built it himself. The outer vault door will open without resistance. The inner lock, the one on the ledger chest, will snap the key shaft on the first full turn. Once the shaft breaks, the mechanical safety latch engages and the vault door seals from the outside. Thorne designed that feature into the original lock 15 years ago as a precaution against exactly this kind of intrusion." Pemberton folded his hands on the desk. "How soon do you expect him to move?" "Tonight, tomorrow night at the latest." Cyprian leaned forward. "Hallowell has been patient up to this point because he needed the key and he needed me incapacitated. He now has both. Every hour he waits increases the risk that someone discovers the key is missing from my desk, or that I recover from my supposed illness and return to my affairs. A man like Hallowell does not sit on an advantage. He will move quickly." "You are certain he will come to the vault himself?" "He came to the chapel in person to collect the key. That tells me he does not trust his own men with the final step. The documents in that vault are worth thousands of pounds in property and leasing rights. Hallowell will want to handle them with his own hands." Pemberton removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, a habit he fell into whenever he was thinking through a problem. "I can assemble 6 night watchmen and 2 constables by this evening. Good men, reliable, and able to keep quiet about their orders. Where do you want them?" Cyprian reached across the desk and pulled the architectural plan from inside his coat, unrolling it flat across Pemberton's papers. The banking house was a rectangular stone building on the east side of the harbour, 2 stories above ground, with a reinforced basement level that housed the private vaults. There were 3 entrances: the main front door facing the street, a side door used by bank staff, and a rear service entrance that opened onto a narrow alley running parallel to the waterfront. "2 men at the front," Cyprian said, tracing positions with his finger. "2 at the rear alley, 1 at the side door. The 6th watchman and both constables inside the building, in the ground floor counting room, with a clear line to the basement staircase. When Hallowell enters through whichever door he chooses, your men hold their positions until he is inside the vault. Once the safety latch seals the door, they move in and secure the building." Pemberton studied the plan. "And if he brings armed men?" "He had 2 with him at the chapel, Creve his lieutenant and 1 other. I expect the same number at the bank. 3 men trapped in a sealed vault room are not a threat to 6 armed watchmen and 2 constables standing on the other side of an iron door." "I want no bloodshed, Lord Ashworth." "Neither do I. That is precisely why the trap is built the way it is. The vault does the work for us. Hallowell walks in, the door locks behind him, and he has nowhere to go. When your men open the door, he will have a choice between peaceful surrender and sitting in a sealed room until he changes his mind. I suspect his patience will run out before his pride does." Pemberton almost smiled at that. He replaced his spectacles and reached for a pen. "I will send word to the bank custodian this morning and arrange access to the building for my men after closing hours. The night watchman will be in position by 10 o'clock tonight. If Hallowell does not come tonight, we hold the same positions tomorrow." "Agreed." Cyprian rolled up the architectural plan and left it on the desk. "One more thing. The vault room has a secondary ventilation shaft, a narrow iron pipe that runs through the wall to the outside. It is far too small for a man to crawl through, but I want it covered on the exterior all the same. Hallowell has a talent for finding exits that other people overlook." Pemberton made a note on a scrap of paper and nodded. "Consider it done. Is there anything else? Cyprian stood and adjusted his coat. Only this. When Hallowell is taken into custody tonight, I want every document on his person and every paper in his known residences seized and catalogued. Letters, ledgers, names of associates, records of payments. His network stretches across 3 counties, and the key to dismantling it will be in those papers. You have my word, Pemberton said. He rose from his chair and extended his hand. Cyprian shook it firmly. Thank you, Horace. I know this is irregular. Irregular is a mild word for a duke in disguise arranging a sting operation in my study before breakfast, Pemberton said dryly. But if it puts Corvus Hallowell behind bars, I will forgive the irregularity. Cyprian left the house through the back garden and retrieved his horse from around the corner. The fog was beginning to thin, and pale light was spreading across the rooftops of Oakhaven. Fishermen were hauling nets on the quay, and a coal barge was being unloaded at dock number 4. His dock, he noted, the one Hallowell intended to steal. Everything was in place. The duplicate key was in Hallowell's pocket. The vault was waiting. The watchman would be positioned by nightfall. All that remained was for Hallowell to walk through the door. Cyprian mounted his horse and turned north toward Ravenscroft Manor. By this time tomorrow, it would be over, one way or another. The banking house sat dark and silent on the east side of Oakhaven Harbour. It was a solid building, 2 stories of grey Portland stone with iron-barred windows and a heavy oak front door reinforced with brass fittings that had been polished every morning for 20 years. During business hours, it was a place of quiet respectability, staffed by clerks in starched collars who spoke in low voices and wrote figures in neat columns with steel-nib pens. At midnight, with the gas lights on the street extinguished and the harbour fog rolling in from the water, it looked like a tomb. Inside, the ground-floor counting room was occupied by 8 men who had been sitting in near-total darkness for over 2 hours. Magistrate Pemberton had positioned them exactly as Cyprian instructed. 2 constables and 1 night watchman waited in the counting room itself, seated behind the long wooden counter where customers conducted their business during the day. They had pushed the brass scales and ledger books aside and arranged themselves with a clear view of the basement staircase at the rear of the room. The remaining watchmen were posted outside, 2 at the front entrance, 2 covering the rear alley, and 1 at the side door, each man tucked into shadow and instructed to remain absolutely still until given the signal. Cyprian sat in the counting room with Pemberton, positioned on a wooden bench against the far wall. He had arrived at 9 o'clock that evening and had not moved since. The only light in the room came from a single candle burning inside a tin box with a sliding panel, angled so that it cast a narrow beam across the floor without illuminating the windows. Pemberton sat beside him with his pocket watch open on his knee, checking the time every quarter hour and saying nothing. The bank custodian, a thin, anxious man named Worsley, had let them in through the side door and then locked every entrance behind them before retreating to a storage closet on the upper floor, where he was under strict orders to remain silent. Worsley had not been told the full details of the operation, only that the magistrate expected a break-in and needed access to the building. He had asked no questions, which Cyprian attributed equally to obedience and to the fact that the man looked too frightened to form a sentence. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Cyprian listened to the sounds of the building, the faint creak of timber settling in the cold, the occasional drip of condensation from a pipe somewhere overhead, the muffled wash of waves against the harbor wall outside. His hands rested on his knees, perfectly still. His mind was not. He had been turning the same question over since the previous evening. Would Hallowell come tonight, or would he wait? Every instinct told Cyprian that Hallowell would move quickly. The man had spent months engineering this theft, planting a servant in the Duke's household, arranging the poisoning, setting up the signal chain, collecting the key in person. That level of planning belonged to someone who valued precision and timing above all else. A man who built his operations like clockwork did not leave the final piece sitting idle. At 23 minutes past midnight, one of the constables held up his hand. Cyprian heard it a moment later. A faint scraping sound, metallic, coming from the rear of the building. Someone was working on the lock of the service entrance in the alley. The scraping continued for perhaps 30 seconds, accompanied by a soft click as the mechanism yielded. The door opened with a low groan of hinges that needed oiling. Footsteps entered the building, measured, careful, placing each step with deliberate control. One set of feet, then a second, then a third. 3 men, exactly as Cyprian had predicted. The footsteps crossed what sounded like the service corridor behind the counting room, heading toward the basement staircase. A brief pause, someone checking the passage ahead, and then the creak of the wooden stairs as the intruders descended to the lower level. Pemberton looked at Cyprian in the darkness. Cyprian shook his head once. Wait. Below their feet, the sounds continued. The basement level of the banking house consisted of a short corridor lined with storage rooms and, at the far end, the vault. The vault door was a massive thing, 4 inches of solid iron set into a stone frame, fitted with a single keyhole above a brass handle. Thorne had built that door to withstand a battering ram. It would open for only one thing: a key turned in a lock. The heavy, grinding sound of iron tumblers shifting into alignment echoed up through the floorboards. Then the deep, resonant thud of the vault door swinging open on its hinges. Cyprian closed his eyes and counted silently. Hallowell was inside the vault. His men were with him. They would be looking at the interior now. The shelves of document boxes, the iron ledger chest bolted to the floor in the center of the room, the brass fittings and reinforced walls that made this one of the most secure rooms on the southern coast. The ledger chest was where Cyprian kept the original property deeds. It had its own lock, smaller, more intricate, requiring the same key that opened the vault door. Hallowell would go straight for it. He had not gone through all of this trouble to browse shelves in the dark. Cyprian listened. He heard movement below, shuffling, the scrape of boots on stone, a murmured exchange between 2 voices that was too quiet to make out. Then, the distinct sound of a key being inserted into a lock. A pause. A sharp, brittle snap. The sound of metal breaking under torque, clean and final as a dry branch cracking underfoot. And then, 3 seconds later, a much louder sound. A deep, mechanical clang that reverberated through the entire building as the safety latch engaged. 12 inches of iron bolt shot home inside the vault door frame, locking the door into the stone surround with a force that could not be reversed from the inside. The vault was sealed. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then a voice from below, muffled by stone and iron but unmistakably furious, shouted something that Cyprian could not make out. A second voice responded, higher and more panicked. Then a heavy impact against the inside of the vault door, followed by another and another. Someone was throwing their shoulder against 4 inches of iron, which told Cyprian more about the state of their composure than any words could have. Pemberton was on his feet. He looked at Cyprian, who gave a single nod. "Now," Cyprian said. The magistrate struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the counting room desk. Warm light flooded the room. The 2 constables rose from behind the counter, straightening their coats and checking the truncheons at their belts. The night watchman moved to the basement staircase and called down in a firm, carrying voice. "This is the Oakhaven Night Watch, acting under the authority of Magistrate Pemberton. The building is surrounded. You are locked inside a sealed vault with no secondary exit. Lay down any weapons and prepare to surrender peacefully when the door is opened." The banging stopped. The muffled voices below went quiet. Then, after a long pause, a single voice rose from behind the iron door, cold, controlled, and carrying the particular bitterness of a man who understood exactly what had happened. "Open the door," Hallowell said. "We are unarmed." Cyprian stood in the counting room and listened to those words travel up the staircase. 6 months of planning, a network of couriers and informants, a planted servant, a vial of poison, and a stolen key. All of it had led Hallowell to a locked iron room beneath a harbour town banking house at midnight on a Friday in October. The trap had held. Every piece had fallen precisely where it was meant to fall. And the man who had built his empire on other people's fear was standing in a box with no way out, waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. The vault door took 4 minutes to open. Thorne had built the safety latch to be permanent. Once the bolt engaged, the mechanism could only be reset from the outside using a specialized wrench that fitted into a recessed socket on the doorframe. The bank custodian, Worsley, had been summoned from his hiding place on the upper floor and now stood at the base of the basement stairs with the wrench in his shaking hands, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Cyprian took the wrench from him gently. "I will do it, Mr. Worsley, thank you." He knelt beside the vault door and fitted the wrench into the socket. The 2 constables stood behind him with their truncheons drawn, flanking the doorway on either side. Pemberton waited at the foot of the stairs with 3 night watchmen blocking the only route back to the ground floor. The remaining men held their positions outside the building, covering every exit. Cyprian turned the wrench. The bolt retracted with a grinding sound that filled the narrow corridor, and the vault door shifted in its frame, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of cold iron and old paper. He stood, gripped the brass handle, and pulled the door open. The vault was a room roughly 12 feet square, lined with stone walls and fitted with wooden shelving on 3 sides. Document boxes, rolled maps, and bound ledgers filled the shelves in neat rows, each one labeled with dates and reference numbers in the careful handwriting of generations of bank clerks. The iron ledger chest sat in the center of the floor, bolted to the stone, its lock facing the door. A stub of broken metal protruded from the keyhole, the snapped shaft of Thorne's duplicate key jammed permanently into the cylinder. 3 men stood inside the vault. Corvus Hallowell occupied the center of the room, directly behind the chest. He had removed his coat and draped it over one of the shelves, and he stood in his shirt sleeves with his arms folded across his chest. His face was composed, pale, tight around the jaw, but controlled. Whatever fury he had expressed in the first moments after the door sealed had been packed away behind the mask of a man who understood that rage was a luxury he could no longer afford. Jonas Creve stood to Hallowell's left, his back pressed against the shelving. The scar on his jaw looked darker in the lamplight, and his hands hung at his sides, opening and closing slowly, as though they wanted to be holding something. His eyes moved between the constables, measuring, calculating, and finding no answer that worked in his favor. The third man, the younger one Marin had seen at the chapel, stood in the far corner with his hands already raised above his head. He looked barely older than 20, with a thin face and wide eyes that darted around the room like a rabbit caught in a lantern beam. Whatever loyalty he owed Hallowell had evaporated the moment the bolt slammed home. Pemberton stepped forward, positioning himself in the doorway with the authority of a man who had done this more times than he cared to count. "Corvus Hallowell," he said, his voice clear and unhurried. "You are under arrest on suspicion of unlawful entry, attempted theft of protected legal documents, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the coercion of a household servant into criminal acts against her employer. You and your associates will be escorted to the Oakhaven jail, where you will be held until formal charges are presented before the county assizes." Hallowell did not move. His pale eyes shifted from Pemberton to the constables, then passed them to the corridor beyond. When his gaze found Cyprian, standing just outside the doorway with the wrench still in his hand, something changed in his expression. A flicker of recognition, followed by a slow, dawning understanding that rearranged every assumption he had carried into this building. "You are supposed to be in bed," Hallowell said quietly. "I have been told I am a poor patient," Cyprian replied. Hallowell's jaw tightened. He looked at the broken key protruding from the chest lock, then back at Cyprian. The calculation was visible on his face. Every piece of the scheme reviewed, tested, turned over for the fault that had brought it down. The poison that was never administered, the illness that was never real, the key that was designed to fail. The maid who had stood in front of him at the chapel with steady eyes and handed him the instrument of his own capture. "The girl," Hallowell said. The word came out flat, without surprise. He had arrived at the answer. "Miss Birch came to me the night your poison was supposed to go into my tea," Cyprian said. He stepped into the doorway, keeping his voice even. "She told me everything. Your network, your couriers, the signals, the instructions, every move you made from that moment forward was anticipated, prepared for, and turned against you. She was paid to do a job. She was threatened into doing a job. There is a considerable difference, Mr. Hallowell, and the courts will recognize it clearly." Hallowell unfolded his arms slowly. For a moment, the room held its breath. Creve shifted his weight, and one of the constables adjusted his grip on his truncheon. Pemberton raised a hand, palm out, signaling patience. Hallowell looked around the vault one final time, the shelves full of documents he had spent months trying to reach, the locked chest he would never open, the broken key that bore the signature of his defeat in its snapped shaft. Then he extended his wrists toward the nearest constable. "Get on with it," he said. The constables moved in and secured all three men with iron shackles. Creve submitted in silence, his face rigid, his eyes fixed on some point on the far wall, as though he could burn through it with concentration alone. The young man in the corner came forward without being asked, stumbling slightly as the constable guided his wrists into the cuffs. Pemberton directed the night watchman to escort the prisoners up the staircase and out through the front entrance, where a covered wagon had been positioned in the street. The procession moved through the ground-floor counting room, past the brass scales and the neat stacks of ledger books and the polished wooden counter, where, in a few hours, clerks would arrive for another ordinary day of business, never knowing what had taken place beneath their feet. Cyprian remained in the basement corridor after the prisoners had been taken upstairs. He stood in front of the open vault and looked at the iron chest with the broken key still lodged in its lock. Inside that chest were the original deeds to 4 commercial docks, leasing agreements worth hundreds of pounds annually, and the legal foundation of a trading operation that employed dozens of families along the Oakhaven waterfront. Hallowell had come within a single turn of a key from seizing all of it. Pemberton returned a few minutes later, slightly out of breath from the stairs. "They're in the wagon," he said. Creve tried to negotiate on the way out, offered to provide names and locations in exchange for leniency. I told him that conversation would happen in my office, in daylight, with a clerk taking notes. "Good." Cyprian reached into the vault and pulled his coat from the shelf where he had left it earlier that evening. "The documents Hallowell was carrying, did your men collect them?" "Everything in his pockets. A folded map of the harbor district, a list of shipping schedules, and 3 letters bearing seals I do not recognize. My clerk will catalogue the lot before morning." Pemberton paused and studied Cyprian's face. "You should go home, Lord Ashworth. You look like a man who has not slept in 3 days. 4, actually. Then go home and sleep for 2 of them. The law will handle the rest from here. I will send word to Ravenscroft when the formal charges have been filed." Cyprian shook Pemberton's hand for the second time in 2 days and walked up the staircase into the ground floor. The front door stood open, and cold night air poured into the counting room, carrying the smell of the harbor, salt, rope, timber, and the faint sweetness of tar from the shipyard across the bay. He stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The fog had cleared while they waited inside the building, and a half-moon hung over the water, casting a silver path across the surface of the harbor. The docks stretched out into the bay. His docks, still his, secured by law and by the broken key of a man who had gambled everything on a scheme built from threats and stolen trust. Cyprian mounted his horse and turned north for the last time. Ravenscroft Manor was waiting, and so was the woman who had made all of this possible. 2 days passed before Cyprian emerged from his supposed illness. Aldrich managed the resurrection with the same quiet efficiency he had brought to every other stage of the deception. On Saturday morning, he informed the household staff that the Duke's fever had broken during the night and that his lordship was sitting up in bed and asking for toast and strong tea. By Saturday afternoon, the word had spread through Alderfield village that Lord Ashworth would survive after all, and the local vicar, who had been privately rehearsing a funeral sermon, tucked his notes back into a drawer with some relief. On Sunday, Cyprian appeared at breakfast in the main dining room for the first time in nearly a week. He was clean-shaven, dressed in a freshly pressed charcoal morning coat, and looked, as Mrs. Garland whispered to the scullery girl, remarkably well for a man who had supposedly been at death's door 48 hours earlier. He ate 2 boiled eggs, 3 slices of buttered toast, and drank 2 cups of tea while reading the previous week's edition of the county newspaper, which contained a small notice on the 4th page reporting that 3 men had been arrested in Oakhaven on charges of attempted theft and criminal conspiracy. The article did not mention the Duke of Ravenscroft. It did not mention a parlour maid. It named the arrested men only as individuals known to the authorities in connection with long-standing criminal activity along the southern coast. Pemberton had kept his word. The details of the operation would remain private, disclosed only to the county assizes when the formal prosecution began. Monday morning broke clear and cold, with frost on the lawns and pale winter sunlight slanting through the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the main drive. Cyprian rose early, dressed without assistance, and spent an hour in his study reviewing a document he had drafted the previous evening. He read it through twice, made one small correction with a steel nib pen, and then folded it into a cream envelope bearing the Ashworth family seal, a stag's head above 2 crossed keys, pressed into dark red wax. At 9:30, he instructed Aldrich to send Miss Birch to the front gardens. Marin arrived 5 minutes later, still wearing her grey parlourmaid's dress and white cotton cap. She had spent the previous 2 days in a strange kind of limbo, performing her household duties as though nothing had changed, while carrying the knowledge that everything had. The other servants treated her no differently. She swept the same floors, polished the same silver, carried the same linens. None of them knew what she had done, and if Cyprian had his way, none of them ever would. She found him standing on the stone terrace that overlooked the front gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. The gardens were Ravenscroft's finest feature, a series of formal beds arranged in geometric patterns around a central fountain, bordered by low box hedges and gravel paths that curved toward the perimeter wall. In summer, the beds were full of roses, lavender, and Canterbury bells. In late October, they were bare earth and brown stems, waiting for the first snow. Cyprian turned when he heard her footsteps on the flagstones. He studied her for a moment. This small, quiet young woman in a servant's uniform who had carried a vial of poison to his door and then helped him dismantle a criminal operation that had been years in the making. "Miss Birch," he said, "thank you for coming." "You sent for me, my lord. I did not have much choice in the matter." The faintest trace of a smile crossed his face. "No, I suppose you did not. Please, walk with me." They descended the terrace steps and followed one of the gravel paths into the garden. The frost crunched beneath their feet, and their breath hung in the cold air like small clouds. A blackbird sat on the rim of the fountain, watching them with the territorial suspicion that blackbirds reserve for anything that moves through their garden. "I received word from Magistrate Pemberton this morning," Cyprian said as they walked. "Hallowell and his 2 associates have been formally charged. Creve has agreed to provide testimony regarding the full extent of Hallowell's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence." The documents seized from Hallowell's person and his lodgings contain enough evidence to dismantle what remains of his network across 3 counties. Marin said nothing. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, her hands folded in front of her. "Your name will not appear in any of the proceedings," Cyprian continued. "Pemberton and I have agreed that your involvement will be recorded only as an anonymous informant acting under duress. There will be no charges against you, no public testimony, and no record that connects you to any part of this affair." Marin let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a week. "Thank you, my lord." They reached the central fountain and stopped. The water had been drained for the winter, and the stone basin was dry except for a scattering of dead leaves that had blown in from the oak trees. Cyprian reached into his coat and produced the cream envelope. "There is one more matter to address," he said. He held the envelope, but did not offer it to her yet. "You came to this house under a forged letter of reference, placed here by a man who intended to use you as a weapon against me. Your position as a parlor maid was obtained through deception, which means, technically, legally, your service contract with this household is void." Marin's face went still. She had expected this. A void contract meant immediate dismissal, no reference, and no claim to the quarter's wages she was owed. She would walk out the front gate with nothing, and finding another position in service without a letter from her previous employer would be close to impossible. "I understand, my lord," she said quietly. "I am not certain that you do." Cyprian held out the envelope. "Open it." Marin took the envelope and broke the seal with her thumbnail. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, written in Cyprian's careful hand and bearing his signature at the bottom beside a freshly pressed wax seal. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the formal language. The document was a contract of appointment. It named Marin Eliza Birch as the primary overseer and administrator of the Ashworth Estate Regional Tenant Fund, a fund established by Cyprian's father 30 years ago to manage rents, resolve disputes, and provide emergency relief to the farming families who leased land across the estate's holdings. The position carried an annual salary of £45, a private cottage on the estate grounds, and permanent tenure that could not be revoked except by an act of the county court. At the bottom of the contract, below Cyprian's signature, was a separate clause written in smaller script. It granted the Birch family, Marin's father, mother, and younger brother, a lifetime lease on their farm at a fixed rent of £1 per annum, secured against any future debt or claim. Marin read the clause twice. Then she lowered the paper and looked at Cyprian with an expression he had not seen before, an openness in her face that broke through the careful composure she had maintained since the night she first knocked on his library door. Her eyes were bright, and her chin trembled once before she pressed her lips together and steadied herself. "My lord, this is too much." "It is precisely enough," Cyprian said. "You saved my estate, Miss Birch. You saved the livelihoods of every tenant and dock worker who depends on the property that Hallowell intended to steal. And you did it at considerable risk to yourself, without any promise of reward, because you decided that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing." He paused and looked out across the gardens toward the distant line of trees that marked the boundary of the estate, land that his family had held for 4 generations and that would now remain secure because a parlor maid with a poisoned vial had chosen to knock on his door instead of walking away. "The tenant fund needs someone who understands what these families face," he said. "Someone who knows what it means to nearly lose everything and to fight to keep it. I cannot think of a better person for the position." Marin folded the contract carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands. She did not trust herself to speak for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice was steady, though it carried a thickness that had not been there before. "I will not let you down, my lord." "You have given me no reason to believe you would, Miss Birch." The blackbird on the fountain rim took flight, rising in a sharp arc over the garden and disappearing into the bare canopy of the oaks. Marin watched it go, holding the contract that carried her name and her family's future in ink and wax, and the word of a man who had chosen trust over suspicion on the darkest night of her life. She tucked the envelope into the pocket of her apron, the same pocket that had once held a glass vial of poison, and walked back toward the house to begin her new work.